What's up, everyone? I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer. Earlier this year, I introduced the Hot Takes format, where I look at a popular opinion and explore it through an alternative lens. Specifically, in episode 18, I looked at Pink Floyd's discography and declared Wish You Were Here as their strongest album, in contrast to popular opinions which may say Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. For episode 32, I want to look at one of the most widely distributed albums in the history of music. A record owned by over 500 million people worldwide, but has been listened to by significantly less than that. An album that, for many people in our digital streaming age, may in fact be the last album that they actually owned. Today, I want to talk about U2's ill-fated and incredibly controversial 2014 album, Songs of Innocence. The album that was uploaded straight to all iPhones and Apple devices like an unwanted software update 10 years and 1 week ago. Let me tell you, when I had this idea roughly a month ago or so and began my research, I was so incredibly stoked to see the timing of my idea and the 10th anniversary of this album. Any hesitation I had about this one was immediately thrown out of the metaphorical window. It was on. For those who don't remember or don't know, Songs of Innocence was the album U2 released in partnership with Island Records, a division of Universal Music and Apple. The album drew much controversy as it was automatically uploaded to all iPhones and Apple devices upon its surprise release. Rather than being met with the level of excitement one might expect to follow a new U2 record, the album and band came under fire. Before most people listened to it, the album was seen as a breach of privacy, a startling wake-up call that our phones, our private devices, may not be nearly as private as all. And while compared to a software update, it is important to note that no one agreed to this update. For most, they went to sleep and awoke to see Songs of Innocence on their phone. Naturally, the frustration of such greatly overshadowed the actual album, and what could have been seen as a revolution to how we distribute and consume music was very quickly largely accepted to be a failure. Songs of Innocence quickly became a punchline, and U2 were social pariahs. For the first time in 10 years, despite the ever-compelling narrative that was Songs of Innocence, I only ever first listened to the album for the first time in the last month. Despite the fact that, like all iPhone listeners, the album has sat on my phone for a decade. This only leaves me further confident that most people have in fact not actually listened to the album. Despite being an Apple user, like most of my listeners, I am also a Spotify user. However, every now and then, I start my car and, for whatever reason, my Bluetooth will open Apple Music before Spotify, and Songs of Innocence will come on shuffle. I'd gotten pretty good at queuing up Spotify before this, but the other day, Volcano from Songs of Innocence played, and my wife plainly and simply remarked, "Ew." Suddenly, it clicked. Songs of Innocence was worth exploring for the sake of an episode. The album we all owned, but had never actually heard. The album that comes on in my car every now and then that I quickly shuffle to throw something else on to cover up the fact that U2 is still on my phone. An album from one of the biggest bands in all of popular music that still a decade on remains shunned and largely forgotten, rather than the warning sign of things to come. An album that could have changed everything about the music industry, but because of being lost in the noise of its own release, no one else has dared to do what they've done. No one else has dared to change how we release and consume music. For today's hot take, I do not plan to defend U2, nor do I intend to praise the greatness of Songs of Innocence. However, I want to examine U2's effort as one of the most important albums of the last decade. A record that marks the beginning of the streaming age and the last time an artist truly tried to shape the way we distribute and consume music in a way that would benefit the artist and the listener alike, while revolutionizing the music industry before the keys were simply given away to the tech giants. Let's start with U2. Formed in 1976 in Ireland, despite toying around with the idea of featuring 2 additional guitarists prior to their first album, U2 remain one of the few bands ever to feature the same lineup for the entirety of their career. Formed by lead singer Bono, guitarist and Canadian wrestle champ The Edge, bassist Adam Clayton, and drummer Larry Mullen Jr., U2 made their debut with their 1980 album Boy. Their breakthrough, however, would come in 1983's War, a record that would spawn massive hits like Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day. At a time when rock was becoming more grandiose and synth-driven new wave music was starting to emerge, U2 represented a proto-alternative rock post-punk sound. From there, the band would release a string of classic albums, records that were driven by what would become classic rock radio essentials. Songs that were absolutely massive then and remain timelessly so now. From the Joshua Tree, Rattle and Hum, Achtung Baby, Zooropa, and How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, U2 have released 15 albums over the course of 44 years. Love 'Em or Hate 'Em, hits like those initial breakthrough singles and, to name a few, Beautiful Day, With or Without You, Mysterious Ways, Where the Streets Have No Names, One, Desire, Vertigo, and so many others have made U2 among the most enduring artists ever. Between an inescapable string of hits decade after decade after decade, with some of the highest grossing tours of the 90s and 2000s, U2, by some metric, must be considered as one of the biggest bands ever. While U2 is often lumped in with classic rock due to their massive radio success and likely from emerging within the 70s, the band is driven by a tight rhythm section and a unique approach to the guitar from The Edge. His sound, aided by an array of effects, would become very distinctive, but more importantly, his approach and tone would become highly influential to alternative rock of the 90s and the 2000s and even present day. Led by the powerful baritone of Bono, the band was seemingly unstoppable, making them a hit-making outfit of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Their influence on alternative rock of the 90s and modern is extraordinary, perhaps even more so within the last 2 decades, as an influx of artists have attempted to transition from rock into a more stable, safe, and contemporary style. From Radiohead to Green Day, The Killers to Dave Matthews Band, and countless others. Many have cited U2 as being one of their biggest influences. Personally, U2 has never actually really been my thing, despite the praises that I've been throwing at them for the last 2 minutes or so. To be fair, however, I've never really given them a chance. Like anyone who can command the sphere of popular music for decades, their influence is incredibly impressive. At times, perhaps even inescapable if you're someone like me. And while I've enjoyed a number of their hits, I really haven't gone much further into their catalog. The only album I gave a chance to was 1987's The Joshua Tree, a record recommended by my drum teacher who surprisingly cited it as his favorite album of all time. You need to understand that at this point in my life, my drum teacher, Matt Sullivan, was throwing bands like Soundgarden and Stone Temple Pilots and all of these incredibly nuanced and hard-hitting 90s bands my way, and everything so far had been a 10 out of 10. So when he said to me that his favorite album of all time was The Joshua Tree, it was like the Holy Grail. I needed to hear this album. Expecting the tension and excitement of maybe New Year's Day or Sunday Bloody Sunday, again, not being very familiar with the band's work, but also expecting the bombast, the excitement, the aggression of maybe a band like Soundgarden or Alice in Chains. I found the contemporary tone of the Joshua Tree to be dull. Perhaps the incredibly acclaimed album is in need of a revisit, and I can chalk this up to being a dumb teenager, like wanting to watch a Marvel movie and walking into a slow-burning, Oscar-winning drama. Maybe I was just ill-prepared. That being said, U2 has been one of those bands that I have been meaning to give a fair try to. Like, how can you not give U2 a chance? They're still a band that could command stadiums over 40 years into their career. It's incredibly impressive. So what has stopped me? And what has also likely been a part of why many other people dislike U2 is Bono. But not necessarily Bono the singer, but Bono the spokesperson, Bono the advocate, Bono the politician. Now, I will preface this by making it clear that Bono has in fact done a great deal to make the world a better place. From his massive contributions to combating HIV/AIDS in Africa through multiple organizations and political task force to his work with Band-Aid and Live Aid, Bono has done much more than simply spread awareness to great issues. He has contributed funding and his talents, while also forming various organizations and even spent months doing frontline work at an Ethiopian feeding center amid a famine. Equally as impressive, he has rallied politicians, governments, and some of the biggest corporate forces to contributing to combating inequity and providing aid and funding to impoverished nations that are faced with grave social, institutional, and infrastructural issues. There is no denying Bono as a global advocate. His work is incredible. However, something about how he carries himself feels incredibly self-righteous and a touch pretentious at times. And by a touch, I mean maybe more than a touch. There's an element of a white savior complex with how he speaks that has always turned me off from his music. Despite this, I read his 2022 book, Surrender, 40 Songs, One Story. It was a gift. And while my initial assessment still rings true, I gained a great deal of respect for Bono as both an artist and his efforts to making the world a better place. So much so that I have been meaning to give U2's catalog a chance, something I intend to go into sooner rather than later, particularly so after having done all the research and listening that I have for today's episode. Despite my thoughts surrounding U2, the Songs of Innocence case study is far too fascinating to simply be written off as it was. So what happened exactly? On September 9th, 2014, after announcing both the iPhone 6 and the Apple Watch, U2 took the stage at Apple's annual Worldwide Developers Conference. The band debuted the new song, The Miracle of Joey Ramone, before Apple CEO Tim Cook made the announcement that their 13th studio album would be made available for free on iTunes. Bono called the album a gift from Apple to all of their music customers and said that the group wanted to get the album to as many people as possible because that's what our band is about. Which, if you think about it, is about as redundant a statement as any artist can make as they release new music, and a rather bland one at that. It exists, so therefore we want you to have it. No splash, no flash, no spice, no pizzazz, just it's there. We want you to have it. Bland, a little redundant, but that was what was made. The album was automatically added to the purchase section of all iTunes libraries and would remain exclusive to Apple on iTunes and the Apple Music precursors, iTunes Radio and Beats Music, for a month before receiving a physical release. Songs of Innocence was made available to more than 500 million iTunes customers in over 119 countries for what Cook marketed as the largest album release of all time. The Edge referred to the release as incredibly subversive. It's really punk rock. It's really disruptive. And before we say, whoa, punk rock and U2, there's a level of truth to this, and we shouldn't discount it. Firstly, the notion of corporate sponsorship that goes beyond that of a record label. At some point, this may have been a telling sign of an artist selling out, whatever that actually means. However, in the context of 2014, we must remember that we are on the verge of the streaming age. Physical media is on life support, perhaps more so then than it actually is now, and we're emerging from a decade of piracy and torrent networks that were leaking albums to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of listeners weeks, even months ahead of releases. The biggest artists of all time were constantly trying to stay ahead from leakers to little result, and the industry goes from seeing some of the highest total record sales in the late 90s to an all-time low within 5 years. Artists were accusing their producers and studio staff for leaking masters, while labels were concerned that artists were doing so as a means of cutting label profits out of the picture. Who was the biggest culprit, though? Del Glover, a man who worked at a CD pressing plant who would send music to various networks for distribution. This in itself is worthy of an episode, but if you're interested, I cannot recommend Stephen Witt's book, How Music Got Free, in addition to the new docuseries of the same name, enough. Both were thrilling and incredibly eye-opening to so much about the technological, social, and cultural shifts that we have seen in the last 2 decades in regards to music consumption. Regardless, with physical sales dwindling in an industry that, due to equal amounts of apathy and hubris, was unable to find a way to get ahead of digital piracy before it was too late, iTunes and the 99-cent song model seemed like the only solution. While this provided fans with the ability to pick and choose songs for a few bucks rather than take a chance on a whole album for $20, artists were still hit with decreased revenue from the new distribution model, which was further compounded by continuously declining physical sales and increased piracy. Rather than selling out, corporate sponsorship, if done right, seemed like a unique way to disrupt the current album cycle while also ensuring that an artist was fairly compensated for their work. The first to do this was actually Jay-Z, who released Magna Carta Holy Grail in 2013 via his label Roc Nation and Samsung. In exchange for purchasing 1 million units of the album up front from Jay-Z at the reported cost of $5 a unit, Samsung then distributed the album for free via their digital storefront. The key difference between what U2 would do a year later being that users had to actually download the album at no cost. If you're a massive artist like Jay-Z or U2, this seemed like a very promising model. Unlike an advance for a label, where they front money for the creation of an album with the plan to recoup the costs from sales and the subsequent tour and merch, this was not a loan. It was guaranteed revenue, while consumers could now receive a highly anticipated album at no cost, with the corporation receiving the benefits of being associated with Jay-Z or U2, almost like a commercial endorsement, while also seeing increased traffic and likely additional sales at their own storefront. This model suddenly seemed like a game changer. Furthermore, Songs of Innocence was a surprise release, something that has become more normalized in the last decade but was still fairly new in 2014. The idea of a surprise release is to forego the traditional promotional cycles in place of dropping an album unexpectedly, something that, no matter who you are, how big you are, is challenging for the simple risk that your album may not cut through the daily noise. A general business practice is the rule of 7, the idea that the average consumer needs to hear of your product at least 7 times before purchasing. A surprise drop sees an artist release their album without the weeks and often months of build-up through singles, music videos, pre-orders, and tour announcements. It proves to be as risky as it is unpredictable. As I learned while doing my research, it was actually Bowie who first attempted this idea with Toy, an album he wanted to record and release as fast as possible in 2001, but eventually would be shelved until its release in 2021. The first official surprise release is often attributed to Radiohead's 2007 In Rainbows, where the band announced the album 10 days before its release and introduced a pay-what-you-can model. While not a true surprise drop as there was that 10-day warning, this was still unheard of at the time. The band cited that the internet was an interesting means of discovering new music and distribution, and their frustrations with their previous release cycles as the main motivating factors for trying this out. A year later, 9 Inch Nails would release Ghost 1 to 4 and The Slip, both independently through the internet without any previous announcements as a means of circumventing any potential leaks, with their manager stating, "The internet searches peak around the leak, not around the single or the album. By the time the album comes out, it's done." Something that shows us that leaks were not only taking artists' revenue, but were also cutting the social and cultural lifespan of their work short, often making an album seemingly dead on arrival. We can see here that not only is the surprise drop a way to shake things up with how you promote your music, how you release your music, but it was also seen as a defensive tactic to prevent the music from actually leaking. If the leakers don't know an album is coming after months of warning through singles, music videos, announcements, tours, commercials, they can't leak the record necessarily. Since then, the surprise release has seen many revisions, with artists like Eminem, who released 2018's Kamikaze and 2020's Music to be Murdered By in this fashion without any warning. Other albums, like the collaborative Jay-Z and Kanye West album Watch the Throne or Frank Ocean's Channel Orange, arrived earlier than their actual release date. Ocean would also surprise drop Endless in 2016, and then, a day later, would surprise drop Blonde. Taylor Swift's 2020 Folklore was delivered with only 24 hours notice, and her 2024 The Tortured Poets Department, while hyped with a promotional release, dropped alongside an unknown deluxe version which featured an additional 15 songs. However, credit must be given to Beyoncé, who has mastered the art of the surprise album. Her 2013 eponymous album was not only a surprise drop, but became the fastest-selling album on iTunes ever. She would follow this success with the highly acclaimed Lemonade in 2016 and would continue to make effective use of the surprise platform with her collaborative album with Jay-Z under the name The Carters with Everything Is Love in 2018. The surprise release format demonstrates another disruptive means of album distribution, one that is significantly riskier than corporate sponsorship, but one that nonetheless discards the typical long-term promotional cycle in place of creating an explosive moment that, if done correctly, has the power to turn all eyes onto whatever you do next, allowing the artist to better promote a tour, video, and even future releases for years to come. If done well, you can create an unforgettable moment with a perfectly timed, well-crafted surprise album. Much to the credit of The Edge, there is something subversive and disruptive to a corporately sponsored surprise album. Hell, you could even argue that there is a punk element in demanding multi-billion-dollar tech giants to pay for your art in the pursuit of making it accessible for the public. I'm sure the band felt they were taking a page from Robin Hood amid an industry that was refusing to reinvent itself for modern artists and listeners alike. This, however, did not save U2 from the ensuing scandal that would plague the release of Songs of Innocence. The album was met with an unstoppable wave of public backlash amid privacy concerns. What made this especially problematic was the automatic music download setting on iTunes, something that most people, myself included, kept in the enabled position, as it would mean that anything downloaded or purchased would then automatically be transferred to your chosen device. The feature was designed to make the downloading process streamlined, and unfortunately, opened the floodgates for Songs of Innocence to be added to hundreds of millions of users' devices. This was seen as a huge breach of trust between the fans and the band, as well as the consumer and Apple. However, U2 really seemed to take the brunt of the complaints, with Apple emerging relatively unscathed, something which I feel is incredibly concerning. Without a doubt, this was a case study that tech analysis have thoroughly examined to see how far they can push the threshold of determining how much of our digital privacy the general consumer is willing to surrender for convenience, for ease, for the delivery of a highly personalized series of content via a new flashy algorithm, and eventually the rise of AI. Terminator-esque dystopias aside, the public truly put U2 through the ringer. Chris Richards of The Washington Post called the release rock and roll as dystopian junk mail. Slate said that it was extremely unsettling, and consent and interest were no longer a requisite for owning an album, only corporate prerogative. Vijay Asar of Wired said, "The delivery mechanism amounts to nothing more than spam with forced downloads. Even now, when Googling the album, among the first page results is a Reddit thread from 2023 with over 157 upvotes and 90 comments resentfully reflecting on the release. Another from just days ago, marking the 10-year anniversary, has some 3,000 upvotes and nearly 500 comments. The backlash among the public and media was relentless. forcing Apple to create an entire page on their website dedicated to removing the album from their devices, which in itself required downloading an entire app dedicated to this very purpose, something I have clearly been far too lazy to actually look into. Bono said he was initially unaware of the automatic download option. This rings true and should have been a concern for Apple to grapple with. While the rollout of this album was seen as U2 forcing their album on the public, the blame for this should have fallen on Apple, much more than it did U2. Former U2 manager Paul McGuinness thought the album had been positioned wrongly and would not have offended anyone if there was not an opt-in method to receive it. Case in point being Jay-Z's Magna Carta Holy Grail, released almost identically the year before without scandal. The only kind of positive remarks I could find regarding the method of release came from Consequence of Sound, who noted that U2 and Apple deserve credit for thinking ambitiously, but they overestimated the band's relevance with fans, and many felt like an automatic download constituted an invasion of privacy. Beyond the complaints from the media and the public, largely centered around the breach of privacy, U2 also faced criticism from musicians who complained that giving an album away for free created a dangerous precedent where music would lose all value in the eyes of the mass market, with fears that this would truly devalue already diminishing record sales. Patrick Carney, drummer of the Black Keys, and someone who always seems to have something to say in the months leading up to and following their own releases, said to the Seattle Times, they devalued their music completely. It sends a huge mixed message to bands that are just struggling to get by. I think that they were thinking it was super generous of them to do something like that. Apparently, drummers had a lot to say about this album. Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason reflected to Rolling Stone, music has been horribly devalued by being given away. It's funny that they didn't sense some of that. It's been the big story of the 21st century, music being devalued. Former Buckcherry guitarist Keith Nelson added, it sent a message to everyone that music is free, and that's disturbing. It's easy to do that when you're a multi-millionaire, billionaire, and money isn't really something that you worry about, but when you're a working rock and roll band and you count on every dollar, it's disappointing to see someone do that. Lastly, Paul Quirk, leader of the Entertainment Retailers Association, after seeing minimal uptick in the streams, physical sales, and downloads of U2's back catalog, further added to these complaints, stating, this vindicates our view that giving away hundreds of millions of albums simply devalues music and runs the risk of alienating the 60% of the population who are not customers of iTunes. Giving away music like this is as damaging to the value of music as piracy. In conjunction with the enable automatic downloads option, perhaps the greatest flaw in U2's plan was their lack of transparency with their intentions. Much like Jay-Z's partnership with Samsung the previous year, U2 were in fact paid up front for Songs of Innocence. Discussing the record with Time magazine just days after, Bono stated, we were paid. I don't believe in free music. Music is a sacrament. According to the Wall Street Journal, Apple reportedly paid a lump sum to the band and Universal Music for a 5-week exclusivity window in which to distribute Songs of Innocence. Billboard estimated that Apple could have paid either $52 million to Universal Music Group for exclusive rights to the album based on the quantity of downloads, or an upfront fee of about $5 million excluding royalties to U2. Additionally, the New York Times reports that Apple agreed to a marketing campaign for the album reportedly worth around $100 million, which kicked off with a television advertisement featuring the miracle of Joey Ramone. If these reports are to believe, Songs of Innocence, U2's free album, was likely their most lucrative studio record in over a decade, and was certainly the easiest $52 million that Universal Music Group had walked away with in the history of the company. Moreover, if we are equating the value of a record to the money it pulls, as the criticism from U2's peers would imply, Songs of Innocence was among, if not the most lucrative album of the last decade, therefore the most valued album. At a $5 million price tag, both U2 and Jay-Z had delivered albums free to the public while receiving far more compensation from an album than they would have if they had actually sold it to their fans. Now, of course, we know this doesn't equate the value of music, but if this was the narrative that the band had pushed, perhaps they would have had to weather much less of a storm. While Jay-Z was proud to wave his corporate sponsorship flag, hip-hop, after all, never seems to have an issue, but rather an affinity for being connected to brands. Jay-Z once famously said, after all, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." U2 may have wanted to bury these reports for fears of facing criticism of selling out. While it was clear that they were partnering with Apple, maybe they didn't want to detail exactly how much they were walking away with. Unlike rap, rock, no matter how successful or how corporate, how safe, a rock band obtains their worth by being anti-establishment. Even if the tour is sponsored by the biggest alcohol companies as the band flies private city to city, they must be anti-establishment to some degree. Now, despite seeming like a total flop upon its release, U2 had actually launched an incredibly successful campaign, even when you don't consider the $5 million paycheck. In the wake of Songs of Innocence, Apple reported 33 million people accessed the album in its first week of release, either through iTunes downloads or streaming. Within its first month of release, 81 million users had listened to it, and 26 million had downloaded the entire record. A far drop from the estimated 500 million, but nonetheless an impressive first month, especially when you consider how the world had turned against U2. How many people would have listened to the album if it had been sold? Possibly less. And while they would have been scandal-free, maybe making the album more accessible actually led to more listeners than people anticipated. Furthermore, while Songs of Innocence has become a frequently cited meme, a punchline referring to the disaster of a release, U2 had recovered. An independent study among iOS users by the Kantar Group found that in January 2015, 23% of music listeners played at least one song by U2, more than any artist for that month. The study also found that of those participants who listened to U2's music, 95% of them accessed at least one song from Songs of Innocence. It reminds me of a quote from Rick Rubin, who once said something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, that there is no such thing as bad art, just things that we aren't ready for. Perhaps that idea also extends to how we present art. So how was the album? Most outlets gave it middle-of-the-road reviews. Metacritic, the site that demonstrates aggregated scores, totals it at 64 out of 100. Most reviews lined up with the Metacritic score, often lining up around the 3 out of 5 stars. However, NME and Pitchfork both gave it 4 and 4.6 respectively out of 10. Curiously, or rather suspiciously, Rolling Stone's David Firk gave the album a perfect score, heralding it as a triumph of dynamic, focused renaissance, 11 tracks of straightforward rapture about the life-saving joys of music, drawing on U2's long palette of influences and investigations of post-punk rock, industrial electronics, and contemporary dance music. After first hearing the album about a month ago, I must agree with the majority of the reviews. Songs of Innocence is a fine album. Nothing exceptional, but nothing bad. In fact, most of it is pretty good. At its best, it has a few great moments, and at its worst, it's just okay. Thematically, the album carries a reflective tone of someone looking back at their own life and finding inspiration in the sounds and events of their youth. Fittingly, the album is named after William Blake's 1789 collection of poems about childhood and how it stands as an era in everyone's life as a period of unbridled discovery. To match this theme, there is an overall contemporary vibe to the music on Songs of Innocence, a record that feels modern, sleek, and highly produced, and on the note of production, marks one of the few times that U2 has really branched out from their roster of Producers mainly consisting of Steve Lillywhite and Brian Eno. In this case, it marked their first and so far only collaboration with Danger Mouse. The production is so modern that at times, rather than leading the herd as they may have once done, U2 often sounds as though they are chasing relevance through the sounds of other pop and alternative influence bands of the 2010s. Despite this, however, there are in fact a handful of standout songs that should not get lost in all the noise surrounding the record. The first is the opening track, The Miracle of Joey Ramone. And while it may seem so far removed from the punk rock influence of the Ramones, the song opens the album with an absolute anthem that celebrates the band's love for punk rock. The song, super contemporary, really isn't all that punk, but that's the thing with art and influences. Once it's out there, you no longer have control over how it's interpreted and reflected in the ether of it all. The Miracle of Joey Ramone feels nostalgic for the marching drums of Sunday Bloody Sunday, with the Edge's guitar absolutely ripping through the soundscape. His tone across this record is fantastic, but his lead lines in particular just fit perfectly, almost playing the necessary foil to the polished production and Bono's clean delivery. Volcano is another great track that follows a tight groove from the drums and bass. Bono comes in over the bellowing bass tone, and despite the groove and the tempo, there is a slight haunting element to it. Once again, the Edge comes through sparingly with some lead lines that feel connected to the style of maybe Josh Homme. The chorus is an absolute bop and is super catchy. It really speaks to U2's ability to keep one foot grounded in alternative influences with another looking to craft a pop track that can appeal to their mainstream audience. Something that can easily imagined to be heard by thousands of fans singing back to you in a stadium. Volcano very well may be the strongest track on Songs of Innocence. However, that title could also go to Raised by Wolves, a song that revels in a sense of intensity and suspense as the Edge performs some of his greatest guitars on the record. Those accenting shots once again cut through the sparse arrangement, and while the word disruptive has been used a lot regarding the release strategy for the album, his lead lines really feel disruptive to the songs in a remarkable way. They cut through, they shove whatever is going on with the drums, bass, and vocals and other guitars out of the way. It's very intentional, it's very powerful whenever those guitars really kind of kick in with the crunch and the aggressive tones that really counter his clean reverb that he uses for most of his rhythm work. And the chorus is absolutely explosive. I would like for it to be a little bit bigger feeling, but again, going back to the pop sensibilities that has made U2 the band that U2 is, the chorus is fantastic and it's explosive. It kind of just the song builds up to it and they absolutely deliver on what they're going towards. Other highlights include Cedarwood Road, Iris, Hold Me Close, and This Is Where You Can Reach Me Now. Again, it's a pretty good album, right? It's not necessarily worthy of the negativity that surrounds it. And the quality of the album further demonstrates that the narrative surrounding this record is purely about the release, not the music itself. Whether you love the album or not, that is not the purpose of today's episode. Rather, my hot take is in reference to the cultural weight and significance of Songs of Innocence, not its quality. After all, big band puts out a good album isn't exactly a hot take. In fact, that take would be served pretty room temperature. In terms of importance, Songs of Innocence stands as a snapshot of an industry in turmoil as it embarks its second major technological shift in less than 2 decades. U2 saw how the music industry, some of the biggest entertainment corporations, handled the rise of the MP3 and the following normalization of digital privacy. As Stephen Witt demonstrated in How Music Got Free, iTunes and the dollar song menu came as a late solution. one that was not necessarily ideal for artists or labels, but seemed like the only option given how digital piracy was not only robbing artists of revenue, but also of their cultural influence. Seeing how slow the major labels were to react to the changing of times and technology, it was very understandable for U2 to look for a new way to distribute their music as the streaming age was fast approaching on the horizon. As Bono described it in his book, we wanted to deliver a pint of milk to people's front porches. We didn't just put our bottle of milk at the door, but in every fridge in every house in town. In some cases, we poured it onto the good people's cornflakes, and some people like to pour their own milk, and others are lactose intolerant. Dairy analogy aside, we should see U2 as not only a band in a position to command change for the streaming era, but one that actually tried to disrupt the promotional album cycle for the consumer and artists alike. While the conversation regarding the value of music was necessary and certainly warranted, the streaming age was fast approaching, and the average consumer would soon have access to essentially all published music in the history of the world, all for the cost of a monthly Spotify subscription in 2015, amounting to $5.78. Music had already spent much of the last decade slowly losing its value, and suddenly, under the guise of being accessible for all, it was to become fully commodified. Like iTunes, streaming services were developed as a means of fully eliminating the need of piracy and the associated album leaks. By making music free to everyone, save a small monthly fee, artists were making a fraction of a cent for each stream, a far cry from the $5 million U2 made up front for 11 songs. The model U2, like Jay-Z before them, were pioneering was one that where labels and corporate sponsors would pay them for an album up front to allow for global distribution. Not only would this benefit the artists, but now the audience could hear an album for free, or more likely just for the cost of the streaming subscription that they would already end up paying for. And such a model, whether we look at the current streaming model or what U2 had planned, eliminates the idea of piracy and leaks because, again, if you're paying $5 for access to all of the world's music, there really is no need to run the risk of getting a subpar leak or getting something wrong or getting malware infected on your devices when you have so much music readily available, more music than you could ever actually listen to. This solved the industry's problems. While this model proposed seems like a strong solution to combating the continued devaluation of music, it raises concerns. Firstly, if labels aren't being paid by an exterior third-party corporate sponsor, then how are they actually making their money? While in the case of U2, Apple did pay Universal Music, but what if there is no external party to provide the funding for the record? If we treat their upfront payment as a purchase of the record, then likely artists will lose all claims to the rights and future royalties of their work, which, to some degree, echoes the record deals of the 60s and 70s. In this scenario, it becomes questionable if artists would have any control over their work post-release or if they would continue to receive compensation after the initial payment. Additionally, such a sale of work may lead to less creative control before the point of sale, whether implied or explicitly stated. If a label or corporation is going to pay for an album up front, their cash may come with various concessions to ensure that they also benefit from the album upon its release. This, of course, can range from lyrical censorship to minimizing more alternative influences and experimental desires to create a more palatable record. All in all, while lucrative, such a model seems very transactional and in some way may make music much more like a product rather than art. Furthermore, a system like this may very well benefit the likes of Jay-Z or U2, artists who are well established in their careers, artists who have innovated and whose artistic output has become synonymous within their respective genres. But as label budgets go towards purchasing albums from artists, this may naturally lead to gatekeeping purely due to fiscal concerns, making it even more challenging for unsigned and up-and-coming talent to break through. Lastly, if albums are being sold for millions of dollars, we must question the sustainability of this model. How long until there is only enough money for the guaranteed hit makers? Such a question would only compound the other issues raised, particularly those surrounding creative control and gatekeeping. It is impossible to say if this model would help the industry or if it would only help the select few artists. This raises additional questions, however. If labels and corporations are paying a flat rate for music in advance, allowing for the public to enjoy the record for free, is music gaining value through the initial sale, but immediately losing its value upon being highly accessible to the masses? Or rather, does it create a culture of curation where music is created by an artist, sponsored by a patron of the arts, and made available for the general population to enjoy? Such a culture feels similar to that of going to an art gallery to observe pieces created by artists, purchased by individuals, and put on display for the people. But it is curious if this model, in fact, increases the value of music but decreases it by mass accessibility. If the average person thinks that music is free, despite someone paying millions of dollars for it, is music actually valuable or not? I don't really have the answer to that one. In some sense, Songs of Innocence marks the final time that a massive artist took a major risk for the purpose of revitalizing the industry. Many artists since have taken a stand against streaming services and how little they compensate artists. However, most of these involve statements made in interviews and social media posts, rarely actually transpiring into action. Some artists have rallied politicians to call for minimum standards that streaming services must adhere to, but little progress has actually been made the legislative route. Some artists took small stands. For example, in 2014, Taylor Swift pulled her music from Spotify after they refused to make it available to only their premium users as requested by her. Eventually, she would return to the platform in 2017, however. Tool famously withheld their music from all streaming services until the release of Fear Inoculum, their long-awaited 2019 album. Similarly, in 2015, Prince removed his music from all streaming services except for Tidal. His estate would add his music back to every service after his passing in 2017. On the note of Tidal, of course, Jay-Z would try to combat inequities of streaming by creating an artist-centered service that would pay more per stream at the expense of albums or an entire artist's discography being exclusive to his new platform, Tidal. Unable to gain the market share necessary to generate substantial change, however, Tidal continues to operate like any other streaming service that does in fact pay slightly more than most competitors, but does not have the exclusive element that was once envisioned. The most interesting case study of an artist combating the devaluation of music was perhaps the Wu-Tang Clan, who in 2015 created Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, an album designed to exist as a single physical copy. The album was sold to Pharma Bro and Martin Shkreli for $2 million at an auction. While much of the narrative surrounding the album has in fact centered on this once-in-a-lifetime album ending up in his hands, the purpose of Once Upon a Time in Shaolin was to reaffirm that music can and should be treated like fine art, or as sacrament, as Bono declared. Cyrus Bozigmer wrote an incredible book documenting the process titled Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, the untold story of Wu-Tang Clan's $1 million secret album, The Devaluation of Music and America's New Public Enemy #1, if you are interested in this story. It is one of my favorite books ever and will hopefully be the center of a future episode, as this is yet another case study demanding further exploration into how we distribute, consume, and understand music as a culture. In this context, Songs of Innocence sees U2 make one of the boldest attempts at redirecting the music industry in favor of artists, and given the backlash they faced, it also stands as one of the final moments something of this nature, something so significant, was ever attempted by an artist with enough of a legacy to sway how we produce and consume music. Had the narrative not been hijacked by the automatic download, they very well may have pulled it off. Instead, most artists are too cautious to dare stick their necks out and attempt anything similar. After all, if U2 couldn't make it work, who really could? In the wake of this controversy, artists and labels alike looked to the tech companies for a solution. Rather than lead the discussion surrounding their own area of expertise, the entertainment industry has allowed for tech companies to dictate the norms of a creative field, ultimately leaving artists in a seamlessly endless pursuit of chasing algorithms rather than leading them. Despite the reports of the Kantar Group, the initial launch of Songs of Innocence was not a success, but I must commend U2 for their effort. They saw a problem and sought to get ahead of it, not knowing the outcome. Had things gone according to plan, and if we ignore the automatic download, U2's Songs of Innocence very well could have been a masterclass in how to release a blockbuster album in the future. After negotiating an upfront fee for their work, they partnered with one of the most recognized tech companies in the world and distributed it at no cost to hundreds of millions of people, making their album entirely accessible. The physical album would have dropped a month later with an additional 4 songs, and the band cut the cost of all previous albums by $3, further expanding the idea of mass accessibility. Songs of Innocence Plus would follow a month after that, exclusively on Apple Radio and Beats Music and iTunes, and would feature an additional 10 songs. The Experience Tour would kick off 6 months later, and the band would spend most of 2015 touring across North America and Europe. If everything had gone right, Songs of Innocence would have marked a milestone for popular music, a blueprint for how to release a record in the 2010s and beyond. Instead, it stands as an album marred by controversy, a controversy that stemmed from the greatest of intentions. Thank you for tuning in to episode 32 of Beats by Jer. Catch me in 2 weeks for my annual summer concert series recap. I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer.